Thank you very much, Your Grace, Professor Miller and Dr. Holman, for your incredible presentations. I will be quick so that I can allow the audience to ask their questions. Thank you for showing us the foundation, the Christian foundation in what we call today humanitarianism, especially in the East, and how in the East the modern language of human rights is present and permeates kind of what we do, whether we know it or not. I have some practical questions, and maybe I know Your Grace needs to go very soon, so I will, if you can help us with maybe one question, and then we'll see what we get, and you can maybe respond later on. In terms of where we always focus, the need to always remain focused on the Holy Trinity and on the Incarnation as our compass, as our goal in what we do and how we interact with our neighbor in humanitarianism. I'm very practical, and I know that most of the people here who work for various organizations know that to do humanitarian work requires money, requires funding. And so oftentimes we as Orthodox Christians are forced to fundraise in order to help our neighbor. And this oftentimes means that we use modern fundraising techniques that appeal to ego or self-preservation rather than self-sacrifice or pointing to the Trinity or something greater than us. It's often we appeal to people's ego in order to raise those funds, in order to do the work that we consider Christ-like. So is there, I mean, how do we overcome this? And how, is there a conflict of interest, so to speak, in the way we raise the necessary resources for humanitarian work? So, Your Grace, if you, before you leave for the airport, if you maybe can consider that.
Well, I'll be leaving, but I'm coming again. Well, I guess that everything depends on motivation, on how we understand our duty. And that is a part that I missed to elaborate in my paper, which is related to the eschatological motivation. Most of the saints and the early practice and the teachings of the Desert Fathers, the idea that we, by helping the other, we are seeing in him God, or some contemporary quotes from, for instance, of Saint Justin of the New of Chile, and that when we have to see in our brethren, in our neighbor, the future co-citizen. And Susan mentioned this citizenship in the kingdom. So I guess also the parable on sheep and goats also refers to this truth that only what that survives in the eschata, in the kingdom of God, that truly exists. So our motivation is inspired by this eschatological vision. So I guess that helps us go beyond utilitarianism, you know, and also overcoming the conflict of interest that you say. But I also admit that I'm not as practical as my previous speakers are. So maybe they can add something more to that.
Thank you, Your Grace. His Grace needs to catch a flight. There's an emergency that he needs to attend to. He will be with us again this evening, and we'll be back tomorrow. So we can also, maybe, Your Grace, add you to a panel, and maybe at that point ask you some questions, or there'll be overlap, especially with theology and kind of the people on the ground. So thank you, Your Grace, for your presentation, and safe travels, and we look forward to seeing you in a few hours. Thank you. Thank you. Secondly, the second kind of idea that struck my mind was this idea of goals and having not necessarily a goal-oriented approach to humanitarianism, but again, as His Grace mentioned, sort of always appealing to the love for neighbor as grounded in the Trinity, in the Incarnation, in personhood, in freedom, in communal existence, in the Eucharist. And yet, Professor Miller, you brought up several, kind of the 3 points that you brought up, one of them being how efficient is Christian humanitarian aid? How good are we in philanthropy? And you looked at and you observed that in the Enlightenment, many of the critics of Christian philanthropy said that it's not very efficient. It doesn't do a good job of achieving its goals. Kind of maybe we can consider what should we use as our metric? How do we know if we're doing a good job? How do we know if we're achieving our goals? And how do we set these goals? What exactly should we be measuring in order to know where to go into, what programs to get involved in, especially since the Orthodox Church, at least all over the world, our resources are quite limited. So how do we know shouldn't we have goals, and how do we set these goals and prioritize them? And kind of my third thing that came to mind in terms of Professor Holman's discussion about human rights. I'm not a human rights expert at all, and there are others here who can speak to this better than I, but given that we're talking about a global context now, it's no longer the ancient Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire where, as Dr. Miller said, sometimes they would come into contact with the other as someone who was not a Christian, but now more and more we're engaging the other, broadly defined. How do we take what seems to be inherent in our Christian principles, human rights language, and apply these principles? And maybe we shouldn't. Should we apply these same principles when engaging in areas where society does not embrace these same principles, the Judeo-Christian, principles of human rights as broadly defined? Does the church change its efforts? Does the church adapt its principles? Does the church stay out of those areas altogether and kind of become inward-looking again, only focusing on those areas where we can kind of work with the natives on the ground who actually understand our principles of love, of human rights, and so forth? Or how do we do this now in a multicultural, global context? How do we bring in human rights, or should we not bring in human rights? Is that not necessary? You hinted at it at the kind of toward the end, and maybe you can give us some more. So here's your microphone. You have your microphone, and you can begin wherever you wish. And of course, if anyone has a question that you'd like to ask, please raise your hands, and we'll get the microphone to you. Should I start with that?
You asked your question.
It's on.
Oh, it's on. Wow. The one thing I was going to say was I actually kind of wrote the paper and got into the thing about orphans and music, as my intent was to say that that's something nobody intended, I don't think, with the orphanages, but they have a huge tradition of music. So there's one of my wife's famous favorite quotes is, "All things work together for good for those that love the Lord." That I see that in the orphanages. The effort of trying to make these children reasonably happy in their unhappy situation. One of the ways of doing that was to encourage them to sing. It teaches them discipline. It teaches them philanthropy in the sense that they have to learn to respect the other person and not sing out of tune or too loud or too soft and so on. So I think there was a kind of a subconscious Christian working out that came to identify orphanages with music, all the way down to this orphanage for African Americans following the Civil War. So that's kind of an unattended thing, that just by being a Christian, you somehow do the right thing over the long run. Now, an exception to that, I was thinking what the Enlightenment was criticizing, and what I think happened, at least in some areas of the West, were these philanthropies. And this might go into this idea of egoism that we were talking about. People that would set up a philanthropy solely for the prayers that the people would say to benefit the founder. That was, I know, common in parts of Britain and also in parts of northern France, so that someone would set up a hospice, but the ecclesiastics that ran it would be having these people constantly say rosaries and constantly, I'm trying to think of other kind of prayers even predating the rosary, but that was just to benefit the soul of the founder and his family. There's some of that with Pantocrator, because I don't know, it seems to me I skipped over that when I was reading. I might have skipped that paragraph. There's a place where the Emperor John Comnenos, John II Comnenos, wants the staff and patients strong enough to participate in a liturgy of petition for the souls of the founders. But it's only once a year, not like some of these ones where they were constantly engaged in that. So I think that, but even with John II, there's a little bit of ego in wanting to build this Pantocrator to be to the glory of his dynasty and for his family and the succeeding emperors that he assumed would be from his family to be buried there. So that's always been part of even Christian philanthropy, but if it's tempered with the right kind of Christian charity, it can work. There was an old pagan, we would call it maybe a vice, but Aristotle's megalopsychia, I think is the word in Greek. Great souledness that's supposed to be, you know, you have this, you're a powerful aristocrat, but it spills out to help the community in a concrete way. And I know that some of the early saints that founded these philanthropies, that word is used to describe them, the megalopsychia, which could be, if you looked at it in the wrong way, pride, but could also be a Christian virtue too. So it is difficult to distinguish those.
So I saw two questions. One is how efficient, how do we deal with honest fundraising? And then the question about rights. So efficiency is a very, very big concern for all of us. I think it's a very modern concern, not that that's wrong. We want to make sure every single penny that we distribute is used properly, and of course in the Haiti earthquake there was a huge, there's an example of just how everyone sees that does not happen, and you feel like you've wasted your money and where has this money gone, and the lives have not been changed. So it's a real concern. And I think there's a lot of issues there, and in humanitarian disaster response, the key is in coordination of at least medical emergencies. I know that when a disaster response team lands on the ground, there's actually an international setup for the way they will dialogue with other groups to make sure that the medical needs are addressed. And that kind of thing could also be done with finances. I don't know that it ever has been done, but clearly there needs to be, that middle piece is the big problem. For us, and I've never administered funds, so I speak as a donor like all of us. The big question is, okay, where do I give my money? And money is only part. I mean, I keep emphasizing in everything that I do that money is only part of what we're to give. But when we give our resources, they leave us, they depart from us, and so they are under someone else's control. There's a lot of actual websites and sources you can go to find out examples of projects that actually work. Two that came to mind, the MIT Poverty Action Lab, PAL I think it's called, has some examples online of projects that they've actually gone out and said, okay, let's see how this works in terms of designing. If you're looking for ideas to designing projects that work, or how they manage their money. Ruth Levine is the editor of a series called What Works that has actually looked at a number of case studies of things that have actually made a difference. There's also websites that you can go to find out accountability. They have different names, Accountability International or whatever, that kind of have a test of different organizations. Many organizations will, and I know this raises raises my respect for organizations that I might give to is they will basically say very clearly only X% of what we receive is used for administration. Or all of our, something I read recently, somebody said everything, the money you give is, all of it goes to the purpose because all of us are volunteers. And I mean, obviously that doesn't work if you have to make a living and you care about caring for others, you have to also make a living. But it's important to be transparent. And I think it's important to be very critical about what you value so that what you use gets used in a way that you value, and we will have different values. Then at the same time as I sort of caution that importance of accountability and transparency, I'm always humbled, spiritually sort of knocked off my feet in a good way by the early Christian text, which, I mean, there is that in the early Christian text, but there's also this sense of, in a sense, you know, let God do the worrying about this. If I think of John the Almsgiver, there's a story of John the Almsgiver where, and it may just be in his life, it may not be him himself, where a beggar, there's a line distributing to the poor, and this beggar is seen to come back 3 times for a handout. And in some texts, you know, they're thrown out. And, but in this text, he gives, and he's asked why, and he said, well, you know, maybe it's my God who is testing me. So I think the challenge is living with that balance, and it's a huge challenge. But I think the deepest responsibility, where, and it may just be in his life, it may not be him himself, where a beggar, there's a line distributing to the poor, and this beggar is seen to come back 3 times for a handout. And in some texts, you know, they're thrown out. And, but in this text, he gives, and he's asked why, and he said, well, you know, maybe it's my God who is testing me. So I think the challenge is living with that balance, and it's a huge challenge. But I think the deepest responsibility lies in those who handle the money for these organizations, and that really that's I mean, that is a deep spiritual responsibility. And I don't think that is emphasized enough. That it's just it's something that really needs attention. It needs, and actually in evaluation because often the funding goes to the organization, and Partners in Health is always often held up as an ideal organization. And one thing that I find very helpful is they focus on evaluation. When you have a program, from the beginning, build in a monitoring evaluation system. I mean, whatever you want to measure. It may not be perfect, but at least then you know you're measuring something. And so those who are distributing know that there's some kind of eye out there seeing what's going on. Because often the funding goes to the organization, and even in the best situations where people are very, very well intended, they just are so focused on the need at the door that they just lose track of what happens. So just a few comments. And then the question about rights. In other countries, this is so... are supporting. That's a big question. But I think it's important to remember that the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is a legal document. The Universal Declaration is not a legal document, but the ICESCR is a legal document that's been ratified by many, many, many countries. Not the United States, and so maybe that's why we're not aware of it. But in many of the countries where the greatest needs are, where many of you will be, are working, have worked, are supporting, ICESCR has been ratified by their national government. And so it's a question of how do you go from knowing that to speaking about it to the local governance, to the Ministry of Health. It's only one piece. Human rights do not feed hungry children, and human rights can only be won't let you do something with legally forced by legal persons and governments. So there's a place where faith-based persons may not have the power to implement rights, but I think it's important to keep them in the conversation and to know what the language is, do your homework to at least be able to talk about it, because sometimes bringing up that issue, if you're in a situation with a soldier, for example, who won't let you do something with a person in need who needs medical help, to sort of be able, in the grace of God, to remind that person that their country has signed this covenant,
as someone who
and
runs a
therefore
small
perhaps there's an
responsibility.
obligation there. But again, it's all, and I'm not an expert either,
efficiency.
so I think we're all learning from one another.
I have taken the position for a long time that you have to pay people to do work.
Hi,
I
I'm
work in
neither
New York
a
City.
theologian
Many of my staff have to live with 2
nor an
or 3
Orthodox
people
Christian.
so that they can work for me. because
So
I don't
I
pay
have
them
a
very
question
well, and I'm ashamed
as
of
someone
that.
who runs a small nonprofit and has the responsibility
I'm proud of what we do, but I'm
of
ashamed
efficiency.
of that. And I think, and so I question
I have taken the position for
the
a
way we
long
look
time
at efficiency.
that you have to pay people
And
to do
for
work.
my own tradition,
I work in New York City. Many of my staff have to live with 2 and 3 people so that they can work for me, because I don't pay them very well, and I'm ashamed of that.
Then how would I know how to treat my neighbor well?
I'm proud of what we do, but I'm ashamed of that. And I think, and so I question
what the
way we look at
responsibility is,
efficiency.
because people may volunteer
And
do
from my
work,
own
do humanitarian
tradition,
work, and that is amazing.
I was trained,
And they probably do that
treat
or
your
often do
neighbor
that
as you would
in
yourself.
addition to other work that pays
But
them so they
then
can
I
feed
was
their
cautioned
children
that if I
and get
didn't treat
health care for
myself
their
well,
families and put their children
then
through
how
school.
would I know how to treat my neighbor
But that's
well?
the same responsibility that many of the people
and
who
so
dedicate their lives full-time every day,
I
10
question
and 12 hours a
theologically
day.
what the responsibility is,
Do.
because people
And
may
they do it for
volunteer
pay as well,
and do
because they
work
still have
and
those
do humanitarian work,
responsibilities. So
and
I'd
that
love
is
to hear about
amazing.
that, 'cause I think it's
And they
important.
probably do that or often do that in addition to other work that pays them so they can feed their children and get health care for their families and put their children through school. But that's the same responsibility that many of the people who dedicate their lives full-time every day, 10 and 12 hours a day, do. And they do it for pay as well, because they still have those responsibilities.
Right.
So I would love to hear about that, because I think it's important.
Every dollar goes for the service. That's an organization that has
I will
either
respond and then I'll let
one
others.
great set of philanthropists, or is
So the question is, what do you do about your obligations to pay them? You have a balance, and you
The
have to.
question is that when we talk about efficiency, and we talk about providing service,
Right.
and we try to measure it in terms of every dollar goes for the service. That's an organization that can either be sponsored by one great set of philanthropists or is run solely by volunteers. But
Well, and then that
organizations
relates to that
where
issue
people are
about
paid,
loving yourself.
You have a balance,
I was
and
trying
you
to
have
think
to-
that
Yeah, you
those
have-
kind of problems
I
are
believe
true of
you have
everything. You know, I
an
work for a
ethical and moral
university,
responsibility
and, you know,
to
I'm
pay
always
them
trying to get my
so that they
pay
can live.
raised, you know.
Not to pay
But
them
at
so
some
that
point,
they
I
can
actually have a
live
defense
off
of
the
university
backs of
professors, but
philanthropists.
what's driving up
But
the
so that
expense
they
of the
can live
universities is
decent
this
lives
competition
while
for
providing
getting people to
service.
come and pay these huge
And I
tuitions, even
think
at
that
public
there is
schools, you know.
confusion
That
oftentimes
it's
when
more
we talk
expensive to go to the
about
public
efficiency.
school I teach at than it was.
Well,
for me to go to
and then that
private
relates to
school.
that issue about
So,
loving yourself versus.
so that
I was
idea,
trying to
what
think,
do you- what is
those
a
kind of problems
fair
are
and
true of
just
everything. You know, I
wage
work for a university,
for an
and, you know, I'm always
employee
trying to
of a
get my
charitable
pay
organization. It really
raised. you
goes
know.
to all of
But
us.
at some point, I actually have a
Too much
defense of
for
university
our
professors,
families
but
or our own
what's driving up the expense of the universities is this
trying to learn modern
competition
Greek. I
for
needed
getting
trip to
people to
Greece,
come
yeah.
and pay these huge
anyway,
tuitions, even at public
so
schools,
all
you
this
know.
kind of thing
That
gets the
it's
point
more
of
expensive to go to the
what's
public
fair.
school
Yeah,
I
but that's
teach
a
at than it
moral
was for
issue
me to
that,
go to
I
a
mean,
private Quaker
everybody
school.
has to face
So,
And it
so
is
that
a- I
idea
mean,
of
it's part of the
what is
basic
a
problem of
fair and just
our
wage
society, I guess. for an employee of a charitable organization, it really goes to all of us, I guess. You know, are we taking too much for our families or our own vacations? Trying to learn modern Greek, I need a trip to Greece. You know? But anyway, so all of this kind of thing gets the point of what's fair. Yeah, that's a moral issue that, I mean, everybody has to face that, I think. And it is a real, I mean, it's part of the basic problem of our society, I guess.
Are one example where this problem. And I would thank you so much for raising that issue, because that is a huge issue. Community health workers are, and certainly the Christian tradition teaches that you need to pay your pastors. So why should it not support the idea that you need to pay anyone who is involved in caring, and that efficiency includes the pay that you're giving to those who are working. And the community health workers is the example that actually comes to mind, because community health workers are one example where this problem exists. In many countries, the community health workers are people in the community who go out and do duties of doctors and nurses, and often in many faith-based organizations and other organizations, there's this sense that community health workers are not paid. They're minimally paid. They're expected to be volunteers, and many times they are destitute, poor, often mothers or grandmothers who are supporting children and taking time out of their lives to do this service, and it's simply not fair. And it doesn't support them. It doesn't acknowledge them. And so there is a real focus in some organizations on the importance of community health workers getting a living wage, getting paid, and at the same time, that example is often going on in many of the poor countries, but I also think of an example called the Congregational Health Network, which in Memphis is part of a sort of a growing trend, a tradition, a pattern, where the hospital, this Congregational Health Network began to connect its churches, recognizing that many of its patients came, who were the poorest patients, were members of churches in the area. So they connected the churches with the hospital, and they created liaisons between the hospital and the church leaders. And then there were people in each of the churches who agreed and wanted to be the liaison, another level liaison, who would then go out when a member of their congregation was discharged from the hospital to help fill that gap. Because in our health care system in the United States today, that gap, once you get out of the hospital and you've had all this expensive care, you fall through the cracks, and it's a serious crisis. So these mediators are the ones who are doing that. And in this case, it's sort of in contrast to the advocacy of paying community health workers. At least in the Memphis example, it turned out that the people who were doing this serving of the community were volunteers, and this was, but they were not just volunteers. They were usually, again, women and mothers and people who were working one or two jobs in addition to this volunteer work they were doing for the hospital. And people burn out from care anyway, we all know that. And if you add to that the burden of having to work in order just to survive, if you care about caring for others, it's a bind.
But it needs to make sure that Bishop Maxime is not here, so I'll kind of take his place if I can, but it's important if we're gonna. It's interesting because Joyce, I found the same thing to be true, that if you want people to work, not that, I mean, the church can do that on your time kind of schedule and your expectations, you need to pay them. But at the end of the day, and I think, at least coming back to like the church, it can be a small nonprofit, a secular nonprofit, an NGO, but the church, I think, not only has to pay, but it needs to make sure that it is paying the right people. So I think it's important, if we're going to engage in this important work, to find the people who actually know how to do the work. So we're not, so it doesn't just become a handout. Not that, I mean, the church can do that. The church can help people in need, find ways to employ them. But at the end of the day, in anything we do, whether it's a university, a church organization, a humanitarian organization, you have to pay, and you have to find the right people to pay. And that's difficult, but I think the fact that there isn't an emperor funding, or not always a major benefactor just throwing money, means that the metric, the compass, you know, is the people out there. Are people who are kind of paying attention to what we're doing are the ones who are going to say whether we're doing a good job, whether we're efficient, whether we're taking care of people by future donations. I mean, that's kind of what you have to do. You know, maybe appealing to donors, not by necessarily appealing to their pride and ego, but by showing them results is important. Otherwise, you won't be able to stay in business. There was a question in the back.
How it is that conceptual precision in terms Thank you to all three speakers. This has been an incredible start to the 2 days, so thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question about the importance of terminology, vocabulary, conceptual precision, because it struck me that in terms of all three speakers, you used the terms humanitarianism and philanthropy interchangeably, but you were very clear that those are not necessarily one and the same thing. So just reflecting on how it is that conceptual precision in terms of the way in which Orthodox conceive of humanitarianism matters. I heard you identify three things. First of all, Bishop Maxime's insistence that we not divorce ecclesiology from sociology. Secondly, for both of you, the highlighting of the importance of conceptual precision in a pluralistic world where the terms that we use and the vocabulary that we deploy make our efforts at humanitarian work actually accessible to and understandable to others. But then finally, in terms of intentionality and outcome, the importance of conceptual precision for doing what you suggested, Dr. Holman, which is to think about what is the intentionality, what are we ultimately aiming to achieve? Is it a short-term crisis response to a crisis, or is it utilizing an approach to humanitarianism that is ultimately transformational and provides sustainable and durable outcomes that do indeed reflect this connection between sociology and ecclesiology? I wondered, did I hear you correctly? Is this, you know, a valid way of thinking about what you've all presented? And I know when we're in the field dealing with, you know, threats to people's lives, et cetera, that, you know, we don't oftentimes think about the words we're using, and yet I would wager that all of us who are here, who engage in this kind of work, use the language that we use because it is, you know, freighted with our own Orthodox identities. So could you say a little bit about whether you think the language really does matter?
Charity, and I've always avoided the word language really does matter. It means so many different things. It's not everything, but it matters. Okay, what words do the Cappadocians? Thank you for that. You did put that very well, by the way. I feel like I can't add a whole lot to that. But I think it matters because... But the reason I emphasize justice versus charity, I've avoided the word humanitarianism. In fact, I had to look it up when I first got the invitation to this event. And I've always avoided the word charity, and I've always avoided the word philanthropy, just because of this. It means so many different things, which is why I was driven back to, okay, what words do the Cappadocians use? What do they mean? How do we distinguish them? Where are they getting them from? I think we're more likely But I think it matters because as we face another person who comes up to us in need, all kinds of internal stuff goes on inside of us. And our response to them will be based on their equality with us, all that internal stuff, and not necessarily what we believe about justice and what we believe about charity. So if we have those words in our mind, if we have a sense that we've thought it through, and we can, I think we're more likely to ask ourselves the question in that moment.
I was thinking,
and more likely to view the other person with dignity if we've really thought about their equality with us in terms of justice and dignity. And their agency, their power to agency. If we don't think of ourselves as, the big patrons, but ourselves as the ones who go to learn. I think language can shape ourselves, and I think that's why it matters.
For the Greek words, I was thinking, and I don't want to say it's 100%, but I think it's almost true, that philanthropia becomes, replaces agape. And partly, I don't know enough actually about modern Greek to know when, agapo becomes also falling in love, and so the whole notion between charity and agape gets confused with the meaning of it as also love, because you hear the songs in Greek, would you even accept agapo and so on. So that's probably partly what happens here. The problem with the word charity, now it's funny that you would mention that, because I picked that up. People always say, well, I never accept charity, and so charity becomes in that term a bad word, but I really see that as one of the really harmful parts of the Enlightenment. If you really need something, become to some extent arrogant to the point that you won't accept something that somebody else would you even accept the salvation that God would offer because it's the philanthropy of God to become man. So if you're not going to accept any charity, and that becomes a negative thing to do, in some sense that's not a Christian way of viewing the word. So it's partly, I think it's again like we're saying, what's a fair salary? When do you really need something? And when is it therefore willing to take because you really need it? And the line is difficult to judge. I can think of my father-in-law. He helped everybody, but now that he's gotten old, he's having trouble with that, to actually be cared for by others. So there's that issue too. I'm trying to, humanitarianism, I never liked the word because it is, again, I think, ultimate, I didn't find a trace of the origin when the word first appears, but I would bet in the Enlightenment. I'm not sure of that. Does anyone actually know that? The idea of getting away from any concept of the divine.
It's a question and an opinion at the same time.
Helping
during the course
humans,
of,
like,
let's say, when we were hearing the
species
presentations,
kind of thing. That's,
especially your presentation, Doctor, we felt that there are a lot of good examples in our history.
Yeah, I don't like the term, but
how
I mean,
we can make
you have
such
to deal with
good
it
examples
now, so
known by all members of our communities
the term.
As Orthodox communities.
I suppose that's probably what we're going to try to do.
Because many people think.
Thank you so much for the speakers.
Social activity,
it's a question and an opinion at the same time. During the course of, let's say, when we were hearing the presentations, especially your presentation, Doctor, we felt that there are a lot of good examples in our history. But how we can make such good examples known by all members of our communities as Orthodox communities, because many people think that the social activities is not based on the true faith, but it's based sometimes on like a social model or social habits, something like this. And we can see that in our context that many initiatives usually come from some rich people who would like really to do something in the society, but at the same time we are not involving all community members, and really which really can be based on the importance of the penny of widow, which can make a big difference in our society, not only to depend on charities or on donations coming from rich people or from big institutions. So this is one. Secondly, the social maybe commitments is a liturgical action, and really, in your opinion, to what extent really we can really make through maybe different advocacy programs, learning programs, to let the entire community understand that the salvation really happened once in the history by our Lord for everybody, not only for a small community or only for the let's say, or for the Jew at that time, but for all humanity. I mean, we are still facing such challenges in our contemporary world, especially, let's say, in big crises where you need, we see that all people become in great need. So a lot of challenges come from the ground. Why you are helping everybody? Why you are not only limit your support to the member of the churches? So we can see that we have like denominational and also challenges, even challenges among different churches, among different church families, among different, for example, religions. So if really we do not really do our work, that it should be based on the true, let's say, believe in our, let's say, history, in our, let's say, faith. Usually I think people all the time really raising a lot of challenges, and many people, because of that, they abstain in donating, let's say, more money, or maybe in helping, and because we see that we receive sometimes some limited sources. This is especially for the Orthodox. This is especially for that specific community. So it's not, if we want to do that, so it's not going to be based on, let's say, the two faiths we have. So this is, let's say, some of my concerns about the humanitarian work in our days, and in how, in your opinion, we can develop this, and also we can see that the issue and the difference and the differentiation between voluntarism and, let's say, having potential, let's say, people to work, let's say, in humanitarian, let's say, field. It's very important in our contemporary, for example, days, that if we receive funding from international organizations and from sometimes from state funds or whatsoever, so we cannot just bring people who do not know how to do the work, because usually we should be responsible for the money we are receiving. So we need sometimes technical people, and those people should be paid well, because also we have to look to the performance and really to build more the trust, for example, on the capacity of any institution. And also here also we have a lot of challenges coming from the community, and really those people who are working in any organization and are being well paid, also facing challenges from the community, from the other people who donate their time to work as volunteers. So in my opinion, maybe we should really develop more, let's say, such kind of education at the level of the community. And also I would like to make a recommendation here, maybe like a second, for example, let's say, workshop could be really to bring all people who are directly involved, for example, in humanitarian work, to really to unify our mission and vision towards, let's say, what does it mean humanitarian work and mission based on our theological teaching, and really at least to have like a concept paper that we all should follow, regardless, for example, if some institutions have different mission and vision based on their, let's say, kind of activities, but at least to have like a document, a guiding document, let's say, in all Orthodox organizations, that should at least to be like the guidance of all our work, in order really to fulfill, for example, the important, for example, maybe objective, because our objective is really to reflect in the end our faith in a very tangible way and in a very visible way, not just to have, let's say, such kind of work to be based on only technical, for example, performance, because otherwise it would be away from, let's say, our faith as Christians, and as, for example, a testimony that we are called to follow and to reflect in our society. Thank you so much.
From the Emperor Emmanuel II. Yeah, that was, I'm trying to think of it. One of the things I would say that I've noticed, and this is, it's not a criticism of Orthodoxy, but there isn't a lot of information outside of Orthodox Christians about Orthodoxy. And to give you an example of this, you know, when the Pope Benedict made that statement, for which he got into huge trouble about the Muslims, you know, is it true that Islam is a violent religion? And he was quoting from the Emperor Manuel II, the Emperor of Byzantium, that wrote, I think it's still unedited actually, a text about Islam, and not necessarily critical, but a debate. So he quoted this guy, and I thought, well, gee, maybe suddenly there'll be interest in Byzantium. And it was picked up by the press, and the fact it was Manuel II was dropped within a day, and there becomes a medieval king. And then the whole reference to Constantinople, the whole problem they had with Islam, and their questions got forgotten. So the other things like that happen. It's just like it just removes anything about the Eastern churches from a serious discussion. So one of the things is getting Eastern Christianity out there as really one of the major players, and not just Protestant versus Catholic, you know, which is most Americans. But we knew actually a minister who wasn't sure what the Orthodox Church was. Remember that? At a dinner we had. So that's problem number one. And then people aren't interested in philanthropy as a subject. You know, I actually offered this from Christian philanthropy, from Christian charity to modern philanthropy. It was a lecture series where you would offer lectures to retired people, and no one would sign up for that one. They were more interested in sexier things than that. You know, although that's at the real heart of Christianity, somehow people aren't that interested. I was surprised. I had a lot of trouble getting my manuscript on orphans accepted. I sent it out to 4 or 5 publishers. Finally, I had, because I went to Catholic University in D.C., I had some strings to pull, and they agreed to do that. Now, the leprosy book, because somehow one of my sons suggested the Walking Corpses title, and that appealed to Cornell, and they picked it up, you know, so now I got a big, you know, press for that one. But the orphan book, and you would think that the problem with children with broken families now, that would be something that people would die to find out about, the successes and failures of the past with caring for children. Book had a huge time getting that book accepted, and then the sales are not too good at
lay education and education of those who are working.
So, but that, I think it's a publicity thing for those two things, the Orthodox Church in general, as a major player in Christianity, and secondly, the fundamental problems, not just to Christians, but to society as a whole. No society seems to be able to come up with what do you do with the poor,
especially to just read the patristic texts on poverty. They're available in English translations. I'll comment quickly. The question of lay education and education of those who are working with you is very, very, very important. And I personally would encourage Orthodox communities writ large to use more adult education opportunities, or especially to just read the patristic texts on poverty. They're available in English translations, both Chrysostom's sermon on Lazarus and the rich man, and then there's a new popular patristic volume a few years ago on all of Basil's sermons on social action that are available in English. Actually, when I finished my dissertation, I had these translations of Basil's sermon on the famine, and then Nissa's 2 sermons on caring for the poor, and I didn't want to include them in the dissertation just because I'm very open to so many people in the world whose Greek is natural. But a man who is in ministry, a scholar who is in ministry, insisted that I must include them in the dissertation because, he said, the dissertation will enable them to be read by missionaries who are working around the world. And that also reminded me that when I was doing the work on Basil's sermon on the famine, the reason I created the translation in the first place was because it wasn't in English, but it was, for example, translated during the Second World War. This obscure sermon on the famine was translated into Romanian and a number of other languages. And I think just that fact reminds us why that would happen. So there's power in these texts. And letting lay people to read the texts is very, very important.
We'll hear from His Eminence Metropolitan Macarius, I'd like to make a comment, and then we can break for a short while before the second panel. But I don't think it's coincidental that all three panelists used examples of hierarchs throughout history that actually were engaging in and inspiring or sponsoring themselves these philanthropic institutions and actually doing the teaching. And so I'm very happy that we'll hear from His Eminence Metropolitan Macarius, who's engaged in such work in Kenya and the African continent, and we know that Archbishop Anastasios is doing similar work in Albania, and there are other bishops around the world who are actually teaching, who are actually inspiring, who are actually the new Basils, the new Chrysostoms, the new Gregories. While I think it's important to read the works of these ancient fathers, I mean, I think it's important that our fathers today teach us by their example. I mean, most of you in here that work for philanthropic, humanitarian, NGOs, these organizations were established mostly by laymen and women. And it's great because now today, the laity is empowered to do this type of work, and they're great partners with the church. But at some point, one must ask, what is the role of the episcopacy today in engaging and teaching and inspiring and asking to do this type of work, in mandating this type of work? Because I think, at least from the Orthodox perspective, when the bishop speaks, he often speaks with authority. So if he makes humanitarian assistance or crisis intervention a priority, then the people start to understand why they also must start engaging in this. So, Your Eminence, I'm looking very forward to hearing you and learning from your own experiences as a bishop in doing this work and how we can learn from you. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, Dr. Holman, and Bishop, of course, Maxime, who's not with us, but will join us later on. At this point, we'll take a short break. And is there one more question that was desperately? Okay. We'll ask.
Thank you, Reverend Simeonidis. It's not really a question. I am Dr. Odikowas. It's just a comment about the issue of terminologies. Let me consider myself as the advocate of the devil. Payments, as always. About the definition of humanitarianism, I think that in a way or other it was misled through the discussions. I completely disagree about the issue of payments. We as Orthodox Christians, we are serving our witness, our Christian witness to our church during our work on humanitarianism. The issue of efficiency, high salaries, payments, this is what we are suffering from. Because all partners, all donors, they consider themselves much more efficient than the locals. And you can see and you can recognize 50% of the pledges is going for the consultants who are coming from abroad. This is not a humanitarian issue. We've been working, we've been practicing, we've been witnessing humanitarianism in many fields, especially in the medical issue. I've been a surgeon and I've volunteered without payments in all wars around the Arab world without taking any penny. So if I want to take a minimal pledge for my medical advice or operations for patients, that's not a humanitarian issue and this is not a volunteer. In our Orthodox tradition, we have to encourage voluntarism. And so I hope that this will be our conclusion, finishing this. Because of that, we've came so many kilometers from abroad and from the Middle East to prove that humanitarianism is still present as an experience and as a witness of our Christianity in a multicultural region. Thank you.
But international organizations like UNICEF and United Nations, as far as I know.
Yes, thank you. I agree with the doctor.
allow me to say that from my experience, it is true that Orthodox people who are coming to work, and I'm talking about Africa, as volunteers, they get very little money. I think they get just for their daily bread. But international organizations like UNICEF and United Nations, as far as I know, they get a lot of money. And sometimes they become rich because of their work as volunteers in the different, yes. So this is the difference between us as a church and the international organizations. Before we conclude, I have one small question to the professor. You mentioned about the hospitals, the orphanages, especially about those people who are suffering from leprosy. And I am curious to know whether we do have any information whether these people who are suffering from leprosy were given Holy Communion.
We have an example of, were they given Holy Communion? I think most everyone knows.
I mean, because we know during the 20th century it was a problem, still.
There's the only place where that's mentioned specifically is actually in a council in Germany in the 8th century. The Pope at the time was from the east, Zacharias the First, I think. Came from around Antioch and was elected Pope. I think most everyone knows there were most of the popes between 650 and 780 were Greeks from the east. And this Pope made this council change. They had wanted to exclude the lepers from communion. And he said, no, you can't do that. You have to give them communion, although he allowed that they would have like a place off to the side where the priest would distribute communion. So they were not to be excluded. But this is, that has occurred in modern times, I guess. I don't know the debates on that, except the only one I did find was
All right, thank you.